Hey class, welcome back, and we are going to get into Chapter 22, Part 2, and we're still talking about World War II. This lecture is going to cover the entry of the United States into World War II, some of the key aspects of the United States war effort, and then finally the conclusion of the war. So we begin today by looking at a map of Europe, and this map shows us the expansion of the Axis influence, the Axis satellite areas brought under control by the Axis powers by the time we get to 1942. So you'll notice here's Germany, here's Italy. These are the Axis powers, right? They had the original alliance before the war began. And then the Soviet Union, which also had an alliance with Germany prior to the onset of the war, is going to switch to the side of the Allies after June of 1941 because Hitler decides to turn his forces on the Soviet Union and ends up carrying out Operation Barbarossa, which was a Germany surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. So that happens in June of 1941, and then the Soviet Union will join on the side of the Allies against Germany. So that's why the Soviet Union is pink in this on this map. And then all the areas here that you see in green, these are all areas that have been conquered and occupied by Nazi forces. So you'll see that their influence is significant by the time we get to 1942, occupying all of these areas of Eastern Europe all the way down to Greece. Significant headway into the Soviet Union, Finland, Norway, France, and then you can see here these fire explosions. These represents battles, the Battle of Britain in the fall of 1940. So by the time we get to 1940, the United States has been preparing to join this war effort on the side of the Allies. In December of 1940, FDR held a fireside chat where he said the U.S. will become an arsenal of democracy. So kind of setting up the American people, or getting the American people used to the idea that we will join this war effort. Now, of course, we already had the Lend-Lease Act, and this allowed then for the United States to supply England, the United Kingdom, with weapons and whatever it needed to carry out its war effort against Germany. But keep in mind that it's a small country kind of stuck here on an island, so it was really in a lot of ways isolated. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union is also busy fighting the Germans. So the Germans now are fighting a two-front war in Europe. Okay, so now we're going to talk about U.S. entry into World War II, and that, of course, begins with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. So the United States actually had been supplying Japan with weapons, with trucks and aircraft, and a considerable amount of oil throughout the duration of the Sino-Japanese War. So if you remember, the Sino-Japanese War begins in 1936, and it continues all the way into World War II. And so the U.S. had been sending shipments of especially oil to Japan. In fact, the United States supplied Japan with 80% of its oil. But as Japan's military forces began to spread, it became clear to the United States that Japan had its eyes set on invading the Philippines. And the Philippines, of course, was also a U.S. territory at this time. So So, but what ends up really sort of tipping the scales is when the United States discovers that Japan planned to invade the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. And at that point, it announces a trade embargo against Japan. And that will basically deny Japan access to oil, scrap iron, and other goods essential for its war machine. So that happens in July of 1941. Prior to that, Japan had already joined the Axis powers, forming the Tripartite Pact, and that happens in September of 1940. So Japan also is going to get a new prime minister. General Tojo will become the new prime minister of Japan, and he is a much more aggressive prime minister, and he basically is going to push for this idea of going to war with the United States. And the reason for this is because Japan wants to invade the Philippines. It knows that the Philippines is a U.S. territory, so it figures if it can destroy the U.S. fleet in the Pacific, it will be able to carry out a successful invasion and occupation of the Philippines. So it begins this secret planning for an attack on the military base at Pearl Harbor, the naval base at Pearl Harbor, which is the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet at the time. It also wants to not only disable all of the naval vessels, but it also wants to disable any aircraft that is stationed on the island as well. And this is just basically so that there can be no immediate retaliation. So in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, Japan carries out this secret mission to attack Pearl Harbor. And for 2 hours, Pearl Harbor is basically bombarded with Japanese airstrikes and air-to-water torpedoes. And a significant amount of life is lost. 2,405 Americans die in this attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the worst attack on American soil until September 11th. It will wound 1,000 people and sink 18 ships. Significantly, there are no aircraft carriers that are destroyed in the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this will be important for the United States moving forward because aircraft carriers are very large. They take a long time to build and they are very expensive, but also they are very strategically critical for carrying out the battles that will be fought in the Pacific. So 18 ships are sunk and a significant amount of American life is lost. However, there will be no aircraft carriers lost. Of course, when this happens, the United States declares war on Japan, and in return, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. because Germany and Italy have an alliance with Japan. So if you click on this video here, it will give you a little bit more detail about the attack on Pearl Harbor. But moving forward, the United States is now going to join World War II. So one of the immediate concerns of the Roosevelt administration and also, of course, California was an attack on the West Coast. And California had become home to large manufacturing industries and particularly aircraft carriers, aircraft, I should say, and also naval vessels in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay. So immediate plans were made to protect the west coast of the United States. This included the camouflaging of important factories, like you see here in this photograph, a before and after photograph of an aircraft factory in Burbank, California. Again, this is so that if the Japanese were to attack and they had military or industrial targets on their map, that they would not be able to tell that this is an industrial target. The other thing that's happening are regular air raid drills and blackouts. This was in the event, this was to prepare the population in the event of an invasion by the Chinese, or excuse me, by the Japanese. So basically you would have these air raid sirens that would go off. Everything would go black. All of the lights would be shut off of the power grid, and people were supposed to duck and cover and shelter in place. And the idea, again, is that if the Japanese were to fly over and carry out an air attack against the West Coast, that it would be difficult for them to find or hit any targets that they may have. Of course, along with all of this came very intense anti-Japanese sentiment, and this we can see reflected in all levels of society. The press, the popular culture, all kinds of played out anti-Japanese propaganda, and the West Coast had the largest population of Japanese people and people of Japanese ancestry living in there in the United States. So it got particularly intense on the West Coast. In the East, there were, in order to get troops mobilized and shipped across the Atlantic, German submarines had to be subdued in the Atlantic Ocean. There were German U-boats that were patrolling up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. They needed to be eliminated before the U.S. could safely deploy troops across the Atlantic. So by the mid-1942, you're going to see that successfully completed, and that's where the United States will then carry out a major troop force into that theater of the war. And we will talk about that when we get there. So one of the security measures that was carried out during World War II was Executive Order 9066. This was an executive order given by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in February of 1942. What it did is it gave full authority to the War Department to determine who enemies of the states were in the West Coast military zone. So it basically drew a line along the western seaboard of the United States and inland, and it said, okay, this area is a military zone. And the War Department determined that all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, meaning citizen and non-citizen, would be determined to be a potential enemy of the state. And so they were Japanese people were systematically rounded up and sent to detention centers and throughout the West Coast and also into remote areas of the country. These detention centers were hastily built, typically barracks, as you can see here in this photograph. You see them in the background. And the way that it would work is the War Relocation Authority, who is the agency that oversaw this relocation to the internment camps, they would post these announcements, or sometimes they would go door to door and they would tell people of Japanese ancestry that they were required on a certain date and a time to report to an area where they were going to be taken to a camp. They were only allowed 2 bags, one for each hand per person, and they basically had to leave anything that they couldn't fit in those bags behind. This was a huge burden for a lot of people, because keep in mind that Japanese people had lived in California, especially for decades up until that point. Some of them owned businesses, some of them owned homes. So unless you had somebody that could take care of those things while you were interned, most people that were interned lost everything. You will see here the numbers of people that were rounded up. 38,000 Japanese immigrants, meaning people that were born in Japan, and 72,000 Japanese American citizens, meaning these were people who were actually born in the United States. So the numbers show that the majority of people that were sent to the relocation camps were actually American citizens. They were sent to these camps for the duration of the war, and they would be required to live in these detainment centers that were basically prisons. They had fences around them, they had armed guards, they could not leave. And again, it was because the United States felt like there was potential for espionage activity and for them to undermine the war effort. So here we see a map of the different internment camps for Japanese people that were located throughout the United States. You'll notice that in California there are two, Manzanar and Tule Lake, but then there are multiple others across the West, and the farthest east that they go is in Arkansas. Some Japanese people will remain in these internment camps all the way until 1946. And as I mentioned, many of these Japanese people will actually end up losing everything. In 1988, the United States Congress issued an apology and gave $20,000 to every survivor of the Japanese internment camps. But for many, of course, that was it was too little too late, and many of them had already died by that point. As I mentioned, anti-Japanese sentiment was rampant throughout the United States, but particularly here on the West Coast. This is this racist sign that was placed above somebody's house in a Riverside neighborhood. So you can really see how strongly people felt about this, and how what lengths they were willing to go to send this discriminatory message to their Japanese neighbors. So at the onset of World War II, the United States was really much more prepared than it was in World War I. And through the Selective Service Act and the draft, you can see that 30 million people were registered, and 60 million men and women will serve altogether in World War II. That will include 1 million segregated African Americans, 500,000 Mexican Americans, 350,000 women, 25,000 Native Americans, 13,000 Chinese Americans, and then 10,000 Japanese Americans who will actually serve towards the latter part of the war, 1944 on, when the War Department actually goes to the internment camps to recruit young men for the war effort in Europe. Many of those Japanese soldiers will be deployed to Italy, where they will see some of the roughest fighting of World War II. So as you can see by these numbers, it's a large army, it's a large military force there, and it's very diverse as well. So here you see an image of members of the Navajo Signal Corps. The Navajo Signal Corps will make a very unique contribution to the war effort during World War II. And to a certain extent, there was some that also served in World War I as well. They just weren't as large. So the Navajo language is a very unique Amerindian language. It is the type of language that doesn't have a root, a connection to other languages. It kind of stands on its own. It's this weird anomaly in linguistics. And because of that, Navajo is very specific. And in order to speak it and speak it correctly, you really have to be a native speaker. Thanks to a lot of Navajo women on the Navajo reservation in the United States, the language has survived. The Navajo language has survived and been passed down through generations. And so the Navajo soldiers that served in World War II were able to communicate with each other through this language. Now, typically, if you want to send a message during wartime, you have to encode it so that if the message is intercepted by your enemy, they won't be able to tell what it is, what type of message you're trying to send. But that can be very cumbersome. It can be time consuming. You have to receive the coded message and then you have to decode it, and it tends to take a lot of time. And so the Navajo were able to speak to each other in Navajo over these transmission lines, and then even if their message was intercepted, the Japanese couldn't decode it. And so it was very useful in sending real-time emergency style messages. And so the Navajo Signal Corps were responsible for sending these messages that neither the Japanese nor the Germans could decipher. And so they made a very unique and important contribution to the war effort. Okay, so the way that I'm going to carry this lecture out is we're going to begin with the war in Europe, and then I'm going to talk about the war in Europe to its end, and then I'm going to switch and go back and talk about the war in the Pacific, and that's just so I don't have to jump back and forth, okay? So let's begin with the war in North Africa and the invasion of Italy. So in January of 1942, U.S. forces begin to arrive in Britain. And when they arrive in Britain, there's a bunch of discussion happening about what the strategy should be. Should the U.S. and the British invade France, the coast of France? Well, the British had already tried that and failed. So the decision was made to try to take North Africa first, because the Nazis had taken over most of North Africa, and now they were moving towards Egypt, and which was a British possession, and they were also looking towards taking the Suez Canal, which is a canal that runs here between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So in order to stop them from doing that, the decision is made to carry out Operation Torch. And Operation Torch begins in November of 1942, and this is the U.S. invasion of North Africa. By May of 1943, German and Italian troops in North Africa will be forced to surrender to the Allies, including the U.S. In July of 1943, the Allies will land in Sicily. And Sicily, of course, is this little ball that the boot is kicking up here in Italy. So they've already secured North Africa by May of 1943. Now they are going to move on to Sicily. By July, just a couple of weeks later, after they land in Sicily, they begin bombing of Rome, and Rome located up here. So they're beginning to attack Italy. And the Italian people are upset by this. They are, they're feeling like maybe they shouldn't have trusted Mussolini. And so there is an overthrow of Mussolini, and this happens also in July of 1943. Towards the very end of July, Mussolini is arrested, the fascist government falls, and you have the nationalist government that is going to take over Italy. So by September of 1943, the Italians surrender to the Allies. However, the Germans will not give up. The Germans are embedded in the Italian peninsula, and so the Germans continue to occupy Rome. The Germans will eventually rescue Mussolini and try to reestablish the fascist government. In October of 1943, the Allies will enter Naples, Italy. In June of 1944, the Allies will enter Rome. And by April of 1945, Mussolini is captured and hung by Italian partisans. So you have this sort of successive uh, conquest of the Italian peninsula. It really is finally secure by June of 1944, but that's after very, very intense fighting all along this Italian peninsula right here. Some of the toughest fighting of the entire war. Now I'm going to show a picture now of Mussolini after he has been attacked and killed by his people, and he and his mistress are going to be hung in a public square in Milan. And the reason why it's important to mention this is just 2 days before Hitler commits suicide in the bunker in Berlin, and he sees this image, and Hitler gets very fearful that that is going to be his fate, and that his body will be desecrated, and so he gives orders to his officers to burn his remains if after he kills himself. Of course, we don't have any proof that that was actually what happened, but that is what the official story is. So anyway, the Italian peninsula secured by June of 1944. This then allows for the Allies to turn their attention to a long-awaited invasion of the coast of France. Now, the coast of France was a heavily fortified area. Hitler had been building his, what he called the Atlantic seawall for quite some time, ever since he had been occupying France in June of 1940. So for 4 years, Hitler had been building these defenses along the French coastline. There were guns that were placed along the coastline. There were troops stationed there. There were obstacles along the beaches embedded in the sand in case troops decided to land on the beaches. There were ramparts and barbed wire and all types of things to prevent vehicles from landing on the beaches. And so the Allies knew that this was going to be a very tricky operation, and it required a lot of planning. This operation is known as Operation Overlord, and it was overseen by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will later on become the President of the United States in the 1950s. It took months of planning, and there are 3 major components to the planning of Operation Overlord. The first is Nazi deception. So the Allies wanted the Nazis to believe that they were going to be crossing and invading at the narrowest part of the English Channel, that they would basically be mobilizing their forces in Dover, England, and then they would cross the English Channel there over to Calais. And I will show you a map in a minute that will show this. But actually what they were planning was to invade and storm the beaches of Normandy, which was a much greater distance than this narrow crossing of the English Channel. But what they did was they sent out false radio transmissions, and they built an inflatable fake army that they basically built up at Dover to get the Nazis to think that that army was mobilizing for an invasion there at Calais. So if the Nazis flew reconnaissance missions over Dover, they would see this army building up. Now, they didn't know that these were blow-up jeeps and blow-up tanks and all of this kind of stuff, inflatable, right? They were totally fake. And then they also sent out fake radio transmissions, again, with these plans to invade at Calais. So they wanted the Nazis to put most of their troop forces and most of their defensive strategy at Calais so that there would be less of a defensive force down in Normandy. Secondly, they had to build special machines. And these machines were meant specifically for this special invasion. So you had, for example, the Higgins boats, which were created to let a large group of troops out onto the beach so that they could run out onto the beach all at once. And I'll show you a picture of a Higgins boat. Other things like floating bridges and wharfs so that the battleships could get unloaded in Normandy, because there were no major ports in Normandy to unload a lot of the equipment. So how are you going to get the equipment from the ships to the beach? Well, they built special bridges for that. And then finally, they had to wait for the right time. So the tides of the ocean are the highest and the lowest at the new and the full moon. And so they decided that they would go ahead and carry out this invasion at the full moon. And this was in order to help their troops, their paratroopers, be able to see in the moonlight when they landed. So June 6, 1944 is the date that was set. And it was actually set a couple of days before, but bad weather ended up pushing the operation back. So the way that it carried out is there was a combination of paratroopers and the aquatic landing. So the paratroopers went first. The paratroopers left in the early morning hours, 2 a.m., and they were brought over France by gliders. And the gliders are planes without engines. They basically glide. And so they were totally silent, and then they dropped a bunch of paratroopers down into France. And then in the early morning hours, right at daybreak, you start this aquatic landing invasion. And this was meant to be like a conveyor belt, where you just had wave after wave after wave of soldiers landing on the beach in order to take it. Of course, it was understood that there would be a large loss of life, especially initially with those first waves of soldiers. So there were 5 beachheads, Juneau, Gold, Omaha, Utah, and Sword. There were only 2 beachheads for U.S. troops. The other troops were the British and the Canadians, and it was Omaha and Utah. It turned out that Omaha Beach was a really important strategic location because it was one of the only beachheads that also had a road leading out of it. So it was very critical to secure that beachhead. It was also one of the most fortified of the beachheads by the Germans. So the first wave of troops coming off of the boats at Omaha Beach, most of them will end up dying. The majority, 80 to 90% of those troops died with the first wave. When the day was over, there were 2,500 Americans dead as a result of the D-Day invasion, but it was successful. And by July 4th of 1944, 1 million troops had landed on the shores of France, and by August 25th, Paris will be liberated from the Nazis. So if you look at this link, you will find out more about D-Day. Okay, so this is a map that illustrates what I was talking about, and this is Dover. So this is where the big fake army was being built up, and the radio signals were being sent out trying to get the Nazis to believe that the invasion force would actually land here at Calais, when actually they were planning on crossing here at this wide point of the English Channel and landing here on the beaches of Normandy. So here you have kind of a blow up of where, so the U.S. beach areas, you can see here Omaha and Utah, and then the areas over here were the British beachheads, the British and the Canadian beachheads. And then you can kind of see the advancement moving forward, and again, they're moving, trying to make their way towards Paris, which will be liberated in August of 1944. So here you have a Higgins boat. So these are a group of troops. They're about to land on the beach. This thing flaps open and allows for the troops to run out onto the beach. Okay, so we're going to turn now to talking about some ways that the war is impacting the United States. Of course, the war is going to be responsible for really taking the U.S. out of the greatest depression it had experienced up until that point. The War Production Board will be a federally run agency that will oversee the production of manufactured goods throughout the wartime. 17 million jobs were created, and lots of people are going to move to get those jobs. So about 15 million people in the United States will migrate to cities for the military industry. This is when we see a lot of people moving to California, because California was the center for a lot of wartime industry during World War II, and so people are going to move from all over the country to California. The other thing that happens during this time period is an increase in union membership. So remember that during the Depression, unions gained a significant legal victory in the National Labor Relations Act, and this gave unions legitimacy. It gave them the right to strike. It gave them the right to collective bargain. And that union membership will continue on throughout World War II and in the post-war years. And we're going to see some of the most affluent time in American society during this period as a result of this strong unionized workforce. Women are also going to join the workforce in large numbers in World War II. 3 million women will enter the workforce. Of course, here's the famous image of Rosie the Riveter saying, "We can do it." And there will be a lot of women working nationwide, 19 million women working, and a lot of those women will stay in the workforce after World War II. So we're going to see a shift in the amount of women working generally outside of the home after World War II. The other thing that's happening back on the home front is more discussions around African American civil rights, and particularly this idea that if we are sending our sons to go and fight, across the oceans against these fascist dictators and these anti-democratic regimes, that we need to also fight the injustices here at home. So this campaign is started, known as the Double V campaign. It's started by an African American newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Double V's in the Double V campaign stands for victory over our enemies at home and victory over our enemies on the battlefield abroad. And the idea being we need to fight, hate and injustice abroad, but we also have to fight hate and injustice here at home. This campaign was endorsed by the NAACP, and the Congress of Racial Equality will be born out of this campaign, created in 1942. And so here we see the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement. So World War II is really responsible for beginning this discussion that will lead to the modern civil rights movement. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about something that's a very difficult subject. Every semester when I teach this, it never gets any easier because it is such a tragic event in human history. And I'm talking about the Holocaust. So in order to really wrap your head around the Holocaust and understand the gravity of it and sort of the inhumanity of it, we need to understand the origins of it, right? So I talked about the stab in the back theory, not even a theory, the stab in the back lie that Hitler told the German people over and over again. So basically you have this anti-Semitic society. And by 1935, Hitler has become the Führer. He is the head of the unquestioned dictator of Germany. Germany is setting its sights on expanding into other parts of Europe, and Germany passes the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws in 1935 were the beginning of severe restrictions put on Jewish people in Germany and also in German-occupied areas. Essentially, what it did was it denied Jewish people the rights of citizenship. It required Jews to wear distinguishing yellow stars, these yellow badges, on their clothing so that they could be identified by law enforcement. It forced Jewish people to live in these segregated neighborhoods known as ghettos. These neighborhoods were oftentimes fenced off, as this one is in this picture, and they were subject to curfew. They were subject to strict restrictions on movement. And it was basically meant to discriminate and to segregate the Jewish population. The other big group of people that were being discriminated against in the Holocaust, and there were others as well, and I'll talk about all of them in a minute, but were the Roma. And the Roma are like the gypsies of Europe. They were seen as not conforming to society. They oftentimes, were traveling performers, or they wandered around. They were seen as being people who lived off of crime. And so they were kind of thrown into this as well. And they were also discriminated against, and they were also forced to wear identifying stars. So all of the groups that were discriminated against by the Nazis had to wear these identifying stars, putting them into whatever group they were perceived to belong to. So the discrimination against the Jewish population began in 1935 and then got progressively worse over time. So that ultimately what we're going to have is the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is a word that refers to genocide, which in a genocide is the systematic extermination of a certain group of people. And it's typically based on some kind of ethnic, racial, religious characteristic of a group. And the Holocaust will begin to be carried out during World War I, beginning in 1941, with Hitler's orders to round up and eliminate all enemies of the state. And the idea was to detain them, force them to work, and or kill them. And so these camps were built throughout these Nazi-occupied areas. The extermination camps, the camps that were meant to kill thousands of people on a regular basis, those were located primarily in Poland. And the reason was because those were areas that were very insulated by the Nazi occupying areas. So they figured, well, they could maybe get away with it in these sort of insular areas. So who is going to be targeted for these systematic detentions and killings? Jews were the number one group, and the majority of the people killed in the Holocaust were Jews. The second largest are the gypsies, or the Roma, who I already described to you as being kind of these wandering people in Europe, oftentimes not really having an identifiable homeland. Number three, political dissidents. These are people who were against the Nazi regime. So these were people who were very actively opposing the Nazis. The mentally and physically disabled. This group was oftentimes detained and then used for the purposes of human lab rats. So they were used at or medical experiments and things like that. Jehovah's Witnesses, there was not a whole lot in these areas, but the ones that were, they were targeted by the Nazis because they were very anti-Nazi and outspoken about it. And then finally, homosexuals. So all of these groups of people were either rounded up and sent to detainment and or extermination camps. On the other hand, there was also a second way that the Nazis attempted to eliminate these quote-unquote enemies of the state, and that was through these firing squads. So where it was not possible for the Nazis to round up large populations of Jews or gypsies or political dissidents, etc., they would go into these remote villages, and they would literally take everybody in the town who belonged, at least in their mind, to any of these groups, and they would take them to the outskirts of the town and line them up and shoot them all. And then throw them into these mass graves. And this is something that we're now discovering as being one of the favored ways of extermination by the Nazis. So it wasn't just the extermination camps, it was also this extermination by firing squad. So by the war's end, there are over 11 million people who will have died in the Holocaust, and that will include 6 million Jews. It's a horrific event in human history. It's one that we have to acknowledge and can never forget, because this type of genocide has happened since the Holocaust and could happen in the future. And so we need to understand that these types of human tragedies happen, and we need to move forward and try to prevent them in the future. So I'm about to show an image that's very disturbing, but it's important to acknowledge. So when the Allied forces finally make it to the concentration camps, this is the type of scene that they encountered. The upper left-hand photograph, of course, shows a pile of dead bodies, and that's because the Nazis could not incinerate the bodies as fast as they were killing them. So by the time the Allied forces got to the concentration camps, they encountered these big piles of dead bodies. And then in the lower right-hand corner, these are people who are alive, but as you can see, their bodies are severely emaciated. And many of these survivors of the camps will actually end up dying as a result of just severe malnutrition, and some of them actually were fed after their liberation, and they ended up getting so sick because their body just could not handle or process food anymore. So please click onto this link. It will talk in greater detail about what the experiences were like for people who were rounded up and brought to these camps. You will need to have a login to a Gmail in order to view this this video, because it is a protected view. If you have a problem with it, you could always copy paste it and put it into your browser, and you may be able to figure out a way around it. But I do recommend watching that video. So if we move ahead now, we can see this is a map of the Nazi detainment camps across Europe. You'll notice there is a lot of them, right? So all of these black dots are detainment camps of one sort or another. A lot of them are work camps. And then you'll see here the black dots with the white around it. These are the extermination camps, as I mentioned, primarily located here in Poland. So these are the camps that had the big gas chambers, the big crematoriums for burning the bodies, etc. Okay, so by the time we get to April of 1945, the Russian army is closing in on Berlin, Germany. And they're able to attack Berlin both from the east and from the south. And Soviet forces will move into the city after massive aerial raids and bombardments by the Allies. Russian troops will invade the city of Berlin, and this is a very famous photograph of a Soviet soldier raising the Soviet flag over Berlin on top of the Reichstag. Hitler had been in his bunker in Berlin since January of 1945, basically held up, running the war from the bunker room, and trying to, protect himself. And he had with him his mistress, Eva Braun. When it became clear that Berlin was going to fall, he actually married his mistress, and then 48 hours later, they committed suicide on April 30th of 1945. Now, this suicide that was carried out in the bunker in Berlin has never been fully proven. And I say that because his body, the remains of Hitler's body, was never recovered. But it was told to the Russians when the Russians came to the bunker that Hitler had committed suicide and that his body had been burned. German forces will unconditionally surrender to the Allies on May 8th of 1945, and that will conclude the European theater of World War II. There is a picture of Hitler and Eva Braun, and this is a picture of the bunker as it was found by the Allies. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about the Pacific theater of the war. So we're going to rewind the clock a little bit, and we need to acknowledge that the Pacific theater of the war was a much more complex war. It was difficult because you're fighting. A lot of the fighting happened at sea, over water. So there's lots of naval battles in the Pacific theater of the war. The majority of American soldiers that die in World War II die in the Pacific theater. It's a tropical environment, so when you are fighting on land, you're typically fighting in jungle, which has its own challenges, and so the progress in the Pacific War was a lot slower. And not to mention the fact that the Japanese were a really formidable enemy. I mean, they fought and they fought and they fought, and they simply did not want to surrender, did not want to give up. So it was very slow going. We're going to begin by talking about the battle at Midway, because that is really a very strategic win for the United States in the Pacific theater of the war early on, and allows for American advancement. So let's begin. So let's talk about the Battle of Midway. And before we talk about that, let's give a little bit of background so that we know where we're at by June of 1942. So the attack on Pearl Harbor happens December 1941. By early 1942, Japan continues to expand in Asia. They expand into Burma, which is now Myanmar, Siam, which is now Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. They will also continue on to occupy Guam, the Philippines, and other Pacific islands. By April of 1942, the Japanese will take the Philippines from the Americans. This will lead to the famous Bataan Death March, which happens in April of 1942, where Japanese soldiers will force 78,000 Americans and Filipino troops to lay down their arms and surrender, and then march them to a Japanese POW camp. So it is a very humiliating moment in American history that the Americans have to give up the Philippines, and from then on the Philippines will be occupied by Japan. But there are two important turning points for the United States. So I would say April of 1942 is really a low point, right? That's when the Japanese will take the Philippines from the U.S. But by the time we get to May of 1942, there is a naval battle called the Battle of the Coral Sea. This is a naval battle in which the United States will turn back a Japanese attack on Australia. So that's a critical win for the U.S. But then you also have this battle, the Battle of Midway, which takes place in June of 1942. And basically the story here is that the Japanese were planning an attack on the Midway Islands, and the United States had military outposts there in Midway. Midway Islands are a little bit further west than Hawaii, so a little bit farther out into the Pacific. And it was sort of the natural jumping off point in order to carry on the war in the Pacific. So the Japanese were planning this surprise attack, but U.S. code breakers were able to detect their plan. And so they were prepared for this attack by the Japanese. And because they were prepared for it, they were able to fight back very effectively. And the end result of this very dramatic battle was that 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and 1 heavy cruiser are going to be destroyed. This is very important, not only because the United States can now advance its fleet forward towards Indonesia and the Philippines and then eventually Japan, but also because now the Japanese aircraft carriers have basically been destroyed. And this is very important for U.S. strategy because, as we mentioned before, aircraft carriers are very large, expensive, and time-consuming to build. And the Japanese simply did not have the resources at this point in the game to do that. So this is really going to disable their fleet. So this is a huge turning point for the Americans. Click on this YouTube link to learn more about this very exciting and dramatic Battle of Midway. So here we have a map again. So here's the Hawaiian Islands. There's Pearl Harbor. That's the one that's attacked in December of 1941. Then you have the Battle of Midway, June of 1942. So you'll notice here there's really sort of this two-pronged strategy. You've got American forces making their way up through Indonesia and eventually to Japan. Then you have this other strategy moving along the Marshall Islands, eventually to Guam. And then splitting the forces here, some of the forces going to the Philippines and others going to Japan, with the ultimate goal of attacking the Japanese mainland. So this map shows you the areas that the Japanese had conquered. You can see the areas that they considered their empire. You can see the areas that are satellite areas, and the farthest Japanese advance. So this is this black line here shows you the farthest Japanese advancement, and again the Battle of the Coral Sea which I talked about a minute ago, is really critical in stopping them from advancing into Australia, and the Battle of Midway, critical for stopping them to advance for a West Coast invasion of the United States. This is also a great map to study. So what you will see here is a timeline. You can follow the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 over here in China, 5, and again, you just get a sense of the timeline of events, important strategic events. Here you have the beginning of bombing raids from China over to Japan. That becomes important. You have Okinawa, which is going to be occupied from April 1st to June 21st of 1945. This is a major battle between the Allies and the Japanese there in Okinawa. It's a huge huge battle and huge loss of life for the U.S., but ultimately will be a major Allied victory. And it was from there that they were going to launch a ground invasion of Japan, but chose instead to drop the atomic weapons. You'll notice here this is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We are going to talk about the dropping of the atomic bombs next. You'll also notice up here the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan. That happens in August of 1945, right before or right after the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. So the Soviet Union had actually agreed with the United States to do a co-invasion, but the U.S. president at the time, Harry Truman, really did not want to see the Soviet Union invade Japan. And so again, that was another factor that was brought into consideration when the decision was made to drop the atomic weapons. You'll also notice here October 1944, that's when the United States is going to begin to take back the Philippines, which had been occupied by the Japanese in 1942. So great map just to study and kind of understand the stepping stone approach to this war in the Pacific. Okay, so we're going to end by talking about the atomic attack on Japan. And so there's a new president for the United States, Harry Truman, and he becomes president after FDR dies in office in April of 1945. FDR actually dies before the surrender of Germany in World War II, and he dies of a massive brain hemorrhage that kills him in mid-April of 1945. And they had been working on, since 1939, a top secret atomic weapons program. And by they, I mean the United States, Britain, and Canada. And they were working on this because they suspected that the Germans were also working on an atomic weapon. And so they wanted to be ready in case the Germans did develop an atomic weapon. And so this project, codenamed Manhattan Project, began. A lot of the research for it took place here in California, UC Berkeley, and other places around the state. But the actual building and testing of the weapons will take place in New Mexico. And when Truman becomes president, this project is so top secret that he doesn't even know about it. And he gets briefed on it when he becomes president in April 1945. And immediately he starts to think about what its implication or application could be in this war effort, and particularly in the war in the Pacific. So the decision is made to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Now, the first successful atomic weapons test will be completed in New Mexico in July of 1945. So it became an option after that. And it won't take the Truman administration long to make the decision to move forward with it. Now, the official reason given for carrying out an atomic weapons attack against Japan is that it would save American lives. It was estimated that a ground invasion of Japan could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. And so the official stance of the Truman administration was, in an effort to prevent that, the decision was made to drop the atomic weapons. So the first weapon is dropped on Hiroshima, August 6th of 1945. At the time that the weapon is dropped, nicknamed Little Boy, it was a uranium-based bomb, there were 280,000 civilians living in Hiroshima and about 40,000 soldiers stationed there. When the weapon is dropped, immediately 70,000 people are going to be incinerated and die, and eventually somewhere around 140,000 will die in the aftermath of the atomic weapons attack, either from severe burns, from sickness from atomic radiation, etc. The Japanese, after the drop of the weapon on Hiroshima, continued to refuse to surrender, and so 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, a second atomic weapon is dropped on Nagasaki. And this is a different type of atomic weapon. This one is nicknamed Fat Man, and it is a plutonium-based bomb. Again, very similar results here. 70,000 people dying immediately, and then over 100,000 ultimately dying from the impact of radiation. When, after, as I've already mentioned, after the first bomb was dropped, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and invades Manchuria. After the second atomic weapon is dropped, the Japanese agree to surrender, and victory over Japan, or VJ Day, is August 15, 1945, with this official surrender of the Japanese to the U.S. So there are two links here. The very first link is a link to a Japanese film called Barefoot Gin. It's an animated film, but it is about the atomic attack on Hiroshima. And it, of course, we don't have any photographic footage of what an atomic weapons attack would have been like, but this particular depiction of it in this animated movie is based on eyewitness accounts and survivors' accounts of the chaos that ensued after the atomic attack. So it's very powerful. It's only a few minutes long. This second one is a longer video, and this is showing the surrender of the Japanese, and it goes into a lot more detail about the circumstances around that, so you can watch that as well. So now we're going to look at some images related to the atomic attack on Japan. These were photographs that were taken from the plane that dropped the atomic weapons. You can see there on the left is Hiroshima, on the right is Nagasaki, and that is the blast after the weapon has been dropped. Here you see some of the devastation from the atomic attack, again completely basically flattening everything in its path. Here is another image of the type of devastation and destruction. And I'm about to turn now to some more disturbing images of humans that have been killed or injured by the atomic attack. So what you see here is one of the ash bodies. So these bodies were of the people that were incinerated as a result of the initial wave of the atomic blast. These ash bodies were all over the ground after the attack, and they actually left a mark on the ground after they had been, after they blew away. And that becomes a symbol of this, this tragedy as well. Here you have an image of a person who is actually still alive. They're in a hospital bed, but they have been severely burned by the atomic blast. So you can see how a lot of people did not survive their injuries. So with August 15, 1945 VJ Day, World War II will be concluded, and you can see here the death tolls. Military deaths, 22 to 25 million people. Civilian deaths, 40 to 52 million. Again, huge numbers compared to World War I. The United States, 416,000 military dead in World War II, for a grand total of 62 to 78 million. And the reason why the range is because some countries didn't keep as accurate records as others did. So here we have military deaths in the Allies. You'll notice that the vast majority of the military deaths in World War II was from the Soviet Union. And you can see here also a huge percentage from China. United States at just 2%, but still that was a very significant number considering the numbers that we're talking about here. If we look at the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, of course, with the most deaths in World War II. So if you click on this link, it has a really good, it's about 20 minutes long, but it shows a graphic depiction of the deaths in World War II so that you could really get a sense of the numbers that we're talking about here. They talk about civilian deaths, and they talk about military deaths, and they divide them up into two different categories. But again, I recommend clicking on it if you have the time. It really gives you a visual sense of the impact and the destruction and the death toll that World War II took on this world. So World War II is responsible for fundamentally transforming the U.S. in a lot of ways. Economically, politically, the United States is going to come out the other side of World War II as a true world power. The U.S. had been working up to it throughout the first half of the 20th century, but really doesn't establish itself as a true world power until after World War II. And that is because certain international organizations are going to be established after World War II that is really going to put the U.S. at the front and center of economic and political dialogue moving forward, international economic and political dialogue moving forward. And then the Holocaust, right? Such this hugely horrible, horrific human event really does, in some strange way, get people to think about the extent to which hate and discrimination and the dark places that that type of thinking and mentality can take us. And so in some ways, the Holocaust does create more support for tolerance and for understanding and for nonviolence throughout the world after World War II moving forward. And then finally, the U.S. is going to experience a huge economic growth as a result of World War II. And there's going to be this huge emergence of a strong middle class and a strong middle class economy in the post-war years. So that's it, and that also concludes this section of the course and the material that will be on exam number 3. Have a good one.